On March 23rd, the U.S. House Energy and Commerce Committee conducted a 5-hour hearing with the CEO of TikTok, Shou Zi-Chew. The hearing came after the Biden administration indicated it may ban the app outright in the U.S. if its Chinese owner refuses to sell its stake to an American company. The U.S. lawmakers pressed Chew over data security practices, its impact on children, and its relationship with the Chinese government. Why is TikTok being targeted by the U.S. government? Has the hearing addressed the concerns properly? And what will be the future of the widely popular app? I'm pleased to be joined from Adelaide, Australia by Simon Lacey, Senior Lecturer of the School of Economics and Public Policy at the University of Adelaide. Simon, thank you very much for joining us. By the way, Simon is also former vice president of Huawei Technology, so always a pleasure to have you on the show. So, as I said, U.S. lawmakers grilled TikTok CEO Mr. Chu, and according to during the hearing, actually, lawmakers repeatedly cut him off mid-sentence and demanded simplistically yes or no answers. Mr. Chu, in contrast, was portrayed to be of patience even when he was being talked over. So why does it appear that these lawmakers have no interest in what he had to say?
Well, I think like so much else in the American political system, this was just an act of sort of political theatre, where politicians line up to get their faces on TV and get sound bites of themselves being tough on China so they can use these back in their congressional districts for their own political purposes. I don't think it served any other purpose than that political theatre and grandstanding, really.
But procedural-wise, why is such a hearing necessary? What is the approach of the Biden administration regarding TikTok that is different from the Trump administration?
Well, I think like in many other instances, we're seeing this sort of talismanic invocation of national security, as if, just by using this justification, every course of action or every government intervention becomes covered in a veil of legitimacy. And so, anyone that challenges that or questions that can be painted as unpatriotic or subversive. But, I think this is going to do very little to actually strengthen national security and even address some of the data privacy or other concerns around the use of social media in the US. And I think this is really just going to further inflame tensions with China, and by doing so, it could actually undermine national security.
How helpful do you think this hearing would be to the American public that the Congress people are supposed to inform? And what can we expect from any possible legislation enacted through such a system?
Well, I think the hearing was probably inconclusive in really sort of changing people's minds or shaping opinions. I mean, most people in the United States would have already sort of made up their minds about, this supposed threat that China represents, and most people or businesses that actually use TikTok or are big supporters of the app, and they're sort of they've gone out of their way to sort of highlight the amazing functionality and opportunities that the app provides to them. So I think the hearing may provide some political cover for the Biden administration to do what it wants to do, which is appear tough on China. And this way it doesn't have to sort of concede that issue to the Republicans, and it also doesn't want to look weak. So I think that was really the purpose that it served the Biden administration.
I'm joined from Beijing, by the way, by Chen Wenxin, Executive Director of the Institute of American Studies of the Chinese Institutes of Contemporary International Relations. Mr. Chen, thank you very much for joining us. So if a ban is put on TikTok, do you think that will really solve America's data privacy problems, which are said to be the concern and the purpose such a hearing would address?
I don't think it will solve the problem, because the U.S. have not a federal law on the data security, and if the sale of TikTok to a U.S. based company, and they will put out restrictions on the data flows, and we are impose now the new restriction on the data security. And so the sale of TikTok just change the company, but it will not solve the problem because the U.S. tech giant will not like the U.S. government to regulate the information flow.
Yeah. Well, Mr. Chu faced intense questioning about ties to the Chinese government, and U.S. lawmakers portrayed the application as a malevolent tool or bad tool used by the Chinese government to track and spy on Americans. We have seen similar stories, Simon, happening with other Chinese tech companies, including Huawei, where you worked as a vice president. So does this mean, do you think the feeling is consistent that the U.S. believes or makes the case that every Chinese company, whether state-owned or private, is controlled by the Chinese government and thus cannot be trusted at all?
Yeah, I mean, look, one of the things that I've learned after almost sort of 20 years of working in trade policy is that when you try to sort of understand why a government, particularly a government is sort of captured by corporate interests as the one in the US, does something, you always have to sort of follow the money. And you do that sort of by asking who benefits from this. So who benefits from a US ban on TikTok? That's obviously going to be TikTok's competitors, all of whom are some of the largest US tech companies with their own powerful social media platforms, and all have similar practices with regard to data privacy to TikTok. So this is going to be, a short-term win for TikTok's competitors in the US, but also a short-term and long-term loss for US users of TikTok, who've been very vocal in highlighting the benefits that the platform brings to them.
A Chinese law was repeatedly cited as evidence that TikTok will provide data to Chinese government if requested. To set the record straight, Mr. Chen, under what circumstances will the Chinese government ask for such cooperation from companies for matters concerning national security? Because we know the Chinese national intelligence law does say any organization or citizen should support, assist, and cooperate in national intelligence work in accordance with law. Is this a unique China practice, or is it a standard practice that's adopted by countries all over the world?
I think it's a standard practice conducted by all the countries in the world, and every country has a national interest for the control, not control, for the managing of the flow of the information. But I think it will aimed at protecting the data security, and also it will aimed at protecting the national security. And it will it's not I think it's conduct all over the world. It's not just to the Chinese government, I think.
Simon, what is your take on this question? You must have been asked similar questions quite often. How do you look at this law, and how, in reality, has Huawei dealt with such a provision, if it has ever been applicable?
Yeah, I mean, this was an issue that Huawei faced a lot of scrutiny for when the law first came out. And I mean, I remember one of the responses of the company was to actually look at what the equivalent legislation was in other countries, and they found that in countries such as Germany and France, you've actually got identical legislation on the statute books, right? And so, and also the US Cloud Act, is very similar. But I think the argument that a lot of countries make is that in other countries you've actually got a system of legal redress against sort of government overreach, and that given the Chinese constitutional system and the realities of how law and politics works in China, that sort of a defense wouldn't work in China. So what Tim Cook did, standing up to an order by the US Justice Department, that just wouldn't fly in China. The reality is, though, that the Chinese government would never be stupid enough to ask one of its companies to basically ruin their own chances of being commercially viable on a foreign market. So the Chinese government would actually never place one of its companies in the impossible position of handing over data and violating the laws in the countries in which they operate. And this was very clear when I was at Huawei, and it's also clear in the case of TikTok, is the Chinese government would just never ask one of its own companies to violate the law in that way in the market that they're operating.
Well, that leads to my final question, which is an important one. If TikTok is treated this way and companies all over the world are watching, what could be the potential implication on the level of confidence in the certainty of investing in the United States, which is labeled to be a free market based on commercial practices? Simon.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think one thing that we should all bear in mind is that there are no real sort of innocents in this game, right? So some of the largest US tech companies and their social media platforms have long been banned from the Chinese market, which is also a shame. I think where the US invokes and abuses national security to achieve its aims, China has done the same for over a decade now under the mantle of information security and indigenous innovation policies. And so what's happening to TikTok is really just China's own chickens coming home to roost. I think we'd all be much better off if China and the US could again learn to trust each other enough to open their respective markets more to each other's companies and technologies, and that would make the world a better and safer place for everyone. I think that's really the lesson we should draw, is that it's really time for the US and China to put aside their differences and to start trying to rebuild trust with one another.
Well, I have to make a point here, because the companies that are not operate, the international social media companies, for instance, if these are the ones you were referring to, they opted not to operate China instead of being banned in China with a broad brush. Considering
that was the case, that was certainly the case with Google search, and that was Sergey Brin's decision taken on principle. But I mean, Facebook and Twitter, Mark Zuckerberg has been trying to get back into China for a long time, right?
Let's also not forget the kind of a political environment that China is living in. We are kind of one against many, and if you are trying to have a regime change or color revolution, you do have to take extra precaution, isn't it? Anyway, that's a different question, and I do get your point about more trust, more communication, probably having an investment agreement between the two countries. I have to leave it there. Many thanks to Simon Lacey as always, and Chen Wenxin joining us from different parts of the world.